Hello everyone, this is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. If you need benchmarking for your vendor data or vendor activity and you can't find any, that's not surprising, by the way. But if you can't find any, in this episode, I discuss how you can create your own. I also provide some resources, a couple of episodes where you can get 25 different KPIs or key performance indicators that you can use that have an explanation of how and when to use each. So keep listening. Welcome to episode 245, Create Your Own Benchmarking for Vendor Data. Now, I get questions all the time that come in from various different resources, and I had one recently that wanted to know if they had, or we had, or I had any benchmarking data that would identify a number of active vendors based on company size. And while I don't think that is available anywhere, I think it really depends as far as active vendors on the type of vendors that you have, the industry that you're in. I think that matters more than company size. Also, whether or not you have PO vendors or not, or you use purchase orders, because that can reduce the amount of vendors based on strategic vendors versus having internal employees just kind of going on a free-for-all for non-PO vendors and using different vendors for the same thing, depending on the employee. But in any event, I did not, and I still don't have any real benchmarking for vendor activity that's out there. And I get a little frustrated every time I see accounts payable KPIs or accounts payable metrics. And what you see most often is cost per invoice. And you don't really see anyone measuring that vendor activity in the detail that I think we need it. And I think it's needed in more than just active vendors. And I will tell you, as a practitioner, we did have accounts payable metrics that went out every month. It was a report. And I think there were 3 different metrics that we had for vendor activity. One, we had active vendors, and I don't know if I've said this lately, but we used to have, I used to have like a multiple ERP environment. And so we would track it by ERP, and then we would do a combined number. So we would do active vendors, and then we would also track the vendors that were inactivated for that month. And then the third one, I think, was either duplicate vendors or duplicate payments, which could be a result of duplicate vendors. It was something about duplicates. So in any event, those were the 3 things that we tracked, and that's really not a lot. And so I will first identify how I answered that question. And then second, I'll give you a couple of more resources where you can go and find 25 different KPIs or key performance indicators for vendor activity and the vendor master file. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, let's start with how I answered that question. So let me repeat the question because it actually has something else in it that I didn't mention. But the question was, I am looking for benchmarking on supplier onboarding. What is the average number of active vendors for a mid-sized software company? And how many new vendors is too many? Thank you. And I will say that how many new vendors is too many, that is completely subjective. And that, I think, was the main reason why I talked about or answered that they needed to create their own benchmarking data. Because how do you know how many is too many? Because just like active vendors, how many new vendors you have or a company has, it's just based on that company's unique vendor mix, whether they use POs and other criteria as well. All right, so here is what I said needs to be done in order to create your own benchmarking related to vendor data. So the first step is to, one, inactivate vendors that are not currently doing business with your company. So select a threshold for vendors to be considered inactive is the first step. And most will use 15 months, 18 months, or 24 months, whatever works for your company. You definitely don't want to use 12 months because then you'll pick up and inactivate annual vendors, and then you'll have to, collect data or all the vendor supporting documentation to activate them again. And you don't want to have to do that when you're using vendors consecutively, annually, on an annual basis, I should say. And then, so that's the first step, select that threshold. And then the second step is now you need to look at vendor activity within that threshold or beyond that threshold to determine which vendors have not been active, right, during that 15, 18, 24 months or whatever month threshold you picked. And to do that, you need to look at 4 different areas of activity. And the first area of activity is purchase activity. And so you need to look at both the close date of purchase orders as well as any open purchase orders or POs. And for most systems, you can't even, inactivate vendors if you have open POs. And so any vendors that have an open PO, right, is automatically still an active vendor. But I will caution in this area that some companies will just keep POs open indefinitely, and you need to make sure that that is not happening in your company, because that keeps that vendor active indefinitely, even though you are not using them. And so you do want to make sure that you're looking at those, blanket POs or POs that have been open for at least more than a year and probably less than that with no activity. All right, so first is purchase activity. Second is invoice activity, right? And so you want to look at both closed invoices or paid invoices as well as open invoices. And again, just like POs, most systems will not let you inactivate vendors that have pending invoices. So the next one you want to look at is payment activity. And, one of the reasons why you want to inactivate vendors is because their information after a while, right, whatever that threshold you picked, is considered stale. So you don't want to pay a vendor that all of a sudden is active again after, right, a certain period of time, because how do you know that their information is still valid? How do you know that their payment information is still valid? And so if you have a vendor that is active, you want to make sure that that payment is going to be successful and that it is still valid. And so the way to do that is to inactivate vendors that haven't had payment activity after a certain threshold of months. Now, I will admit that this is probably a duplicate of the invoice activity, because when you're making payments to invoices, but there could be other scenarios out there where there isn't an invoice, and so you'll catch those payments in those scenarios as well. But it could be a duplicated invoice activity, but it doesn't hurt to include it in that review. Now, the last one is a vendor record modification activity. And just like the reason for payment activity, right, one of the main reasons that you want to inactivate vendors is to make sure their information isn't stale. And if the vendors have recently updated their vendor record, then that means their information is not stale. Now, I will admit here that any modification or update to the vendor record in the vendor master file will probably trigger a modification date. So how do you know of payment activity, or if there remittance information, I should say, or maybe an email address, or maybe something insignificant triggered that modification date to be updated. But I would say, compared with the other activity, this is good to include as well, because you will have those vendors out there that have not had activity, right, just below your, or just above your threshold, that all of a sudden they are going to be used again. And so they know their information has changed, and so they submit it to you, or submit it to the internal team member that will submit it to you to update their record. And this way you will catch those vendors. Now, all four of these should be looked at in combination, and only those vendors that have not had activity in each of these four activity areas, or should I say all, right? So you don't inactivate a vendor that has had activity in the invoice activity area, but has not had activity in the, let's say, payment activity area, right? Because maybe that invoice hasn't been paid yet. You want to make sure that you do a combination of all four and look at it really on a vendor by vendor basis. Now, I will say that some systems do have the ability to inactivate vendors automatically. And if that is the case, you do want to make sure that you understand what activity your system is using to inactivate vendors. And if you choose to use that automated process, which I will tell you is a lot easier, because now no one has to look at that. No one has to pull reports and look at that information on a case-by-case basis or vendor-by-vendor basis. But just understand that most of those systems out there don't look at all four areas of inactivity. And so you want to make sure that you understand what it's looking for and just document that. And if you determine that that's fine, then that is what you will use, and it will save you some time, but it also may inactivate more vendors than would have been inactivated had you done that internal or manual, I should say, review. All right, so that was the first part of the answer, was to inactivate vendors that are not currently doing business with your company. The second step I identified was to track the number of new vendor adds. So review the process for adding new vendors, and if applicable, if there is a purchase order policy, identify if it's being followed, because we all know that if you have a purchase order policy, sometimes it's followed and sometimes it's not. So hopefully you have a purchase order compliance program where someone's kind of looking at that, because if that is the case and the purchase order policy is not being followed, there may be too many vendors being added by internal team members, right, versus a purchasing team that sources, for example, for strategic vendors. And so this directly answers the question, or part of the question, as to whether or not, how do you know if there's too many new vendors? Well, it may be too many new vendors if you've got internal team members adding new vendors outside of the purchase order policy. And with this one, if possible, track by vendor type, by account category, however you separate your vendors, if you do that in your accounting system or ERP, or you can also do it by the department submitting requests. And I say that because in the past, as a practitioner, we had actually, in one of my roles, we had one of our departments submit probably a high, like 80%, 70 or 80% of our vendor requests. And so we did track them separately to see if there was any, so we can track, right, if they were increasing or decreasing their requests. And by the way, this has nothing to do with this podcast episode, but they also had a lot of urgent requests. And so we tracked that too. And then we met with them to see why they were having so many urgent requests. And come to find out, they didn't really realize that they could submit vendor requests at a specific point in their process with gathering that information. And so that was just another win actually for both of us, so that they could reduce the number of urgent requests. Because on their side too, it required that they, had to track us in order to submit the invoice for payment. All right, so now that we had these two things, or now that you are tracking these two things, where you're inactivating vendors that are not currently doing business with your company, and then you're tracking the number of new vendor adds, now you can look at some benchmarking, right? Track the beginning number of active vendors minus the inactivated vendors plus the new vendor adds, and then track each individually. So one, do this on a monthly basis. That's ideal. But if you can't do it on a monthly basis, do it quarterly, semi-annually, or yearly, if that is helpful for you, if you only need it on an annual basis. But I do recommend on a monthly basis. You'll get trends a lot easier that way, or a lot faster that way. Start looking for patterns and anomalies, which are usually indicative of bad processes, not following policy. So things like, is there a time of the year where new vendors spike, right? So if you have your year end, let's say it's December or maybe it's June, then you want to see if you have a, new vendor spike, and maybe you do, right? Because everyone's trying to get those vendors in or those invoices in before the end of the year that they've been holding on their desk like all year long, right? And now and there were new vendors, so now you have to have new vendors, right? So you want to make sure you document that. Also, you want to look to see if our vendors being inactivated that were never used. And this kind of goes back to inactivating vendors, right? So if you've had a vendor that was created or submitted to have a new vendor be added, and you never use that vendor, so come the threshold, right, 15, 16, or 15, 18, 24 months, whatever you chose, that vendor was inactivated, that really means that there's something wrong in that process. And I know that that is a reason why a lot of companies will require an invoice in order to create a new vendor. But you do want to track that. And as you track it, you do want to go back to the resource to see why that happened. Maybe, right, this is one of those instances where you've got non-PO vendors, either, because it's not following the policy, or maybe it is, and you just have a non-PO vendor, and they get the vendor set up, but then choose not to use them and just never notifies the vendor team. And so you want to make sure that you have processes in place to make sure that that internal employee knows to do that if they opt for, say, a different vendor for that service or product. And the last area that I recommended in this response or answer that is benchmarked or looking for patterns and anomalies is with duplicate vendors. So I have found that there are usually about 5% on average of active vendors that are duplicates. And the longer that you go in between, or maybe if you've never looked at it or you don't know because maybe you inherited a vendor master file, that 5% can be more than 5%. And so there was one vendor master file cleanup that I did where they had not checked for duplicate vendors in at least 2 years. And I think it was just longer than that, but that was their guesstimate. They had 9% duplicate vendors. And in this case, right, they had almost 16,000 vendors, which, right, is close to 160 duplicate vendors. And as we know, duplicate vendors can lead to not only the potential for fraud, right, but it can also lead to duplicate payments. So you definitely want to make sure you're checking for duplicate vendors. And then track it to see if there is, right, a trend. And so in the benchmarking, just as a summary here, you're going to track the beginning number of active vendors minus the inactive vendors plus new vendor adds. And then you're going to track each of those individually. So active vendors, inactivated vendors, new vendor adds, and then that formula of beginning number of active vendors minus inactivated vendors plus new vendor adds. And then you're going to do that monthly if possible, but quarterly, semi-annually, or yearly is acceptable. And then you're going to start looking for patterns and anomalies, right, with the new vendor adds, right? Is there a time of year where there is a spike? Then are vendors being activated that were never used? And then do you have, right, duplicate vendors? So you're going to be tracking the duplicate vendors for trends and anomalies. Now, you can do the same, right, with other metrics or key performance indicators. And key performance indicators I like because it really reveals like performance issues. And what I have, I talked about it earlier, was the resources that I have that you can look at or listen to get 25 different KPIs that can be tracked for both vendor setup activity, right, vendor request activity, and then the vendor master file activities, right, to understand your vendors in the vendor master file. And so what I have is I actually split it. So I have 25, again, KPIs for accounts payable, vendor maintenance. Part one is to understand your vendor master file. And then part two is to understand your vendor request activity. And so I've got it split into two, and I do have it both in blog form and also in podcast episodes. So podcast episodes 36 and 37 is the two episodes where they are split. And I don't know which one is which, but I think 36 is the vendor master file and 37 is the vendor request activity. But I also have it in blog form if you choose to read it or if you like to read it. And I will put links to that or to those two blogs in the show notes. So I hope this helped you identify how you can create your own benchmarking for vendor data, because I will tell you that I was frustrated in that area because it really wasn't anything that was tracked when I was a practitioner. And I really don't see any reports or benchmarking to date that really include the details around vendor activity and the vendor master file records that are helpful. And I tell you, I know it's important, but if I see cost per invoice one more time when talking about AP activity that does not include vendor record or vendor request activity, I'm just going to explode. I probably won't, because I will have to explode, because that's really what you most often see. Not that it's not important, but the vendor data and activity is important as well. I also do want to say that I talked in the beginning about how I get questions all the time, and I welcome them. You can always email me at Debra@DebraRRichardson.com, and that email address is in the show notes. But you can also register on the Vendor Process Training Center for free as a user, and you get quite a bit of resources that you would not get had you not registered, like the vendor validations that's included in the resource library. That resource library also includes things like the NACHA operating rules that are related to vendor request or vendor activity. But you also get the ability to sign up for a free weekly Q&A drop-in live session. That's really what it's called. And every Friday from 12 to 2 Eastern time, I am live, and you can sign up for this training session. You don't have to be there from 12 to 2, right? That whole 2-hour period. I will be there for that entire 2-hour period, but you can sign up for that. And then anytime during that period on Friday, you can drop in, ask your question, and then go on about your day. And so that is always available to you. Again, it's at no cost. All you have to do is register on the Vendor Process Training Center, and you can attend any Friday Q&A session. And if you are worried about it being recorded, it is absolutely not going to be recorded. It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So what happens on those calls stays in those calls. I will say, though, that for transparency, I do turn that little configuration feature on, that where everyone can see who else is on, right? So that if you want to, just check out who's on, you can do that. And so you can see them, they can see you. But in most cases, that's really a good thing, because sometimes I will get, multiple people on that kind of help each other out with their questions to say, right, this is what I do. I had that issue too. And so you can see who's actually responding to you, or see who you are responding to. So if you are interested in that, you can check out any Friday. I probably will not stop doing that anytime soon, because on the Vendor Process Training Center, I have, lots of training sessions, and many folks take those, or many vendor team members will take those because they have issues to resolve. And so after taking the training session, right, if they think of questions, I always have that Q&A session on Fridays that they can always pop into and ask their questions, especially for those training sessions where I have templates that they can go and fill out. Many of them I do. And so if they have questions and filling out that template, the training session is over, but they can always come into the Q&A session. And so it's always available to those that take training sessions. And then those users that haven't taken a training session, but have a question related to vendor setup and maintenance. All right, so that is it for today. I hope I gave you some valuable content. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 245th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.